Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? So we're like halfway through day one. It's good stuff this morning. I was in one of the earlier AM sessions. It was really good stuff on VDI bake-offs. So thank you for coming. This session is titled The Reality of RemoteFX and VDI in Windows Server 2012. Server 2012 is bringing a lot of interesting things, specifically around virtualization, to the forefront. RemoteFX has been around for a little while, actually kind of a short while. It's been out there. The buzz of it has been out for a while. We've been hearing about all these things coming from Callista Technologies, acquisition, and what RemoteFX was going to bring. But 2012 is kind of the first, I would say, realization of that, of a lot of that, the fruits of that. SP1 brought some capabilities, but it was pretty limited in what it was able to do. So for this session, we're going to talk about RemoteFX. We're going to talk about VDI and some of the changes that are also affecting RDS in general. And then kind of cover some of the things that also tie around virtualization for Server 2012, because they're all tied together. When you look at VDI, you look at the virtualization, the infrastructure underneath, the remoting protocol, these are all pieces that are kind of tying themselves together and locking up the different pieces. All right, so maybe we go manual. So we're going to kind of explore the different pieces of the technology, where RemoteFX was, where it came from, what it is today, the changes that are affecting both that and VDI and RDS in 2012, and then kind of discuss what all that means. What does that mean to VDI in general? What does that mean to what we do on a day-to-day basis? Brian made some really great comments this morning in the keynote about consumerization kind of colliding with what we do on the desktop. And having spent a lot of time in the VDI space, eons in remote desktop and Citrix, a lot of time helping clients try to move to Windows 7 or the next generation desktop or the any device, anywhere, anytime type of a mentality. There's a lot of stumbling blocks that are out there. Some of them are technical, some of them are operational, some of them are people related. So we kind of want to talk about what all those things mean. And this is, I don't know if you knew when you walked in the door, but this is kind of interactive. So I'm going to struggle to pull opinions and thoughts out of you guys here. So feel free to participate in that. And I put a disclaimer at the bottom that this session has a good amount of fact in it, and there's a good part of opinionated banter on my part. So I will try to point out where that opinionated stuff really occurs and where it's fact. So what is RemoteFX, and why should we care about it? So it really began with the Callista acquisition back in 2008. There was a lot of buzz around this. Callista was a small organization, about 30 plus people, and they had written some technology to accelerate or compress remoting protocol. And Microsoft snatched this up as part of their bigger picture, wanted to constantly improve what RDP brought to the table. And you notice over the years that there's always that synergy between Citrix and Microsoft, or Quest and Microsoft, and these different remoting protocols that are out there. And you'll have Citrix will advance their feature set, Microsoft to kind of creep onto their territory a little bit, but always maintain a boundary where they'll take it so far and then leave the rest up to Citrix. This is one place where they started to kind of step on things. This anything with RemoteFX was first realized in SP1. So anybody have any experience rolling out Service Pack 1? Anybody in here played with the RemoteFX technology? So did you set it up in a lab, set it up in production, set it up how?
It never worked because of
87.
Special VDI, this and that never worked.
Yes, I will definitely agree with you. I won't say it never worked, but it was certainly a pain in the butt to get working. Anybody else try to set it up? What was that?
Set it up in the lab.
On 2012. A lot easier in 2012. Much more forgiving. One of the things that we discovered, we actually set this up, one in semi-production, we call, I guess, production pilot, several POCs that we did with it. Boy, is it picky about the hardware you're using. It's very, very picky about the hardware. But SP1, is somewhat new. SP1 hasn't been around for a long time. It brought three key things. It brought a new codec for RemoteFX to do some acceleration around video and 3D. It gave us a virtual GPU, and this was the first time that any hypervisor vendor had virtualized a GPU. There's a lot of work being done by Citrix in the Zen world. VMware is trying to tackle it in the View world about trying to time slice or allocate hard allocations of GPU time over to virtual machines and carve it up. This was just pure virtualization. They just sucked it into the hypervisor layer and dealt it out as required. There were some restrictions, obviously, but Windows 7 virtual machines running on HyperV SP1, provided they had the SP1 integration services, would allow you to use a virtual GPU, which would just time slice on those physical GPUs you had in the box. And then the third thing, which was really interesting, anybody here, geez, when was it? I think was it 2 years ago? Nellie Porter did a great demo on, what did she do? Who was here 2 years ago when she did that? Was it Guitar Hero? And she had that rigged up through an RDS. It wasn't RDS, it was a VDI session running Guitar Hero. You could actually play Guitar Hero. That was using the RemoteFX USB redirection. And the big benefit of this is that you don't need the drivers on the endpoint device. So you can plug in any device into this thing. I don't need to have any specific drivers. I have drivers loaded up on the server side. It's basically extending a USB cable across whatever that connection is through the virtual channel and allowing that device to load up on the server side. So I can get very easy USB type access without having to worry about, is the device installed here, the device driver installed on the server. It brought some interesting things. But these last two items there, with the asterisk there, HyperV, GPU, and the USB redirection, they only worked in VDI. So you had to use Windows 7 VDI on HyperV. RDS did virtually nothing for it. Gave a nice codec so that I could stream movies through an RDS session and have some pretty fluid video for it. There's not a whole lot of, we haven't seen a lot of enterprise requirements for that kind of a thing through an RDS session. But it was something that certainly proved out that there's technology out there to bring things along. Some of the other things that it did was it gave you multi-monitor support in VDI, right? But didn't we have multi-monitor support already? Can't we do that through RDP already? Right? We could do up to 4 monitors through RDP. But what this gave you was it would give you full 3D aero capabilities across multiple monitors. So the point was to bring the technology closer to what the end user experience is on the physical desktop into the virtual realm. So nice stuff that it did. But some of the challenges, you see this hardware list up here. Anybody who's played with this on the 2008 R2 SP1 side, you ran into a hardware problem because it was picky about the cards that you put in there. And these aren't simple cards. This isn't something you're going to find at Best Buy that you can just run down, plug one into the server. These are big, fat, heavy, power-hungry, heat-blaring monsters that go in the servers. They take up multiple PCI slots. They have heat sinks that are running about that thick, about that big. They are pretty much beasts in the servers. And they're close. We did a test with the NVIDIA Tesla cards. We had 2090s in there. And we were like, well, why isn't this working? The cards are virtually identical, except they're missing one hook somewhere in the hardware for that to enable RemoteFX. They supported DirectX 9C, they supported DirectX 10, but there was some restriction that prevented them from working in RemoteFX. And there's I don't have it off the top of my head, but there's actually you can look at the event logs on a system when you're trying to log in to determine whether am I actually using RemoteFX or not. And it will tell you in the event log whether the RemoteFX virtual GPU was generated at the time the system was turned on. We couldn't figure out why, and it's because we need the 2070 Qs, which looked identical, but they were different cards. So the hardware was very, very picky. It's very hungry, does a lot of things. And really the limitations that it brought was this was RDP only. The best benefits around USB redirection were just for VDI. It required very, very specific GPUs, expensive GPUs, only a few models that were there, and really the benefits were pretty few. So it was great that I could do this, but how many business requirements are out there that I need to have a multi-monitor full aero experience? How many business requirements are out there that require me to have full motion video support through a VDI session. Probably the biggest one is there. But otherwise, a lot of the other things that RemoteFX brought didn't really help so much on the VDI side because a lot of customers have found out VDI is not the silver bullet that we were promised it would be. Customers are falling back into RDS in order to leverage that, and some of these key benefits weren't working. And the pain going through that process to try and get this RemoteFX thing working was, it was painful. That last bullet there is a bit opinionated. So today, what is RemoteFX and why should we care? So RemoteFX has changed. Microsoft's capitalized on the buzz that was created with RemoteFX. This is now an umbrella brand that kind of covers a bunch of technologies that are associated with RDS, that are associated with, or really with RDP itself, and some of the pieces that kind of surround that. And you can kind of think of the relationship when Citrix spun up HDX, and they converted ICA to HDX overnight. And HDX was, well, it's not really replacing ICA, it's enhancements to it. But ultimately, they've gotten to the point where ICA is dead, it's all about HDX now. So it's sort of like that, but it's an umbrella of a bunch of technologies that are looking to optimize this. So what are some of the things that are new? These are things that have been advanced. These are part of the RemoteFX umbrella, and these are advancements into the RDP protocol that comes specifically with 2012. And I'm going to preface this with, understand, every time that Microsoft releases a new version of whatever, server operating system 2012, Windows 8, whatever it is, there's a new remoting protocol that goes along, or a new RDC client that comes with that, version 8, which will be required to take advantage of these things. And there are restrictions on what that will work on. So today I will tell you Vista will not work with this. XP is dead. You'll never see XP support any of these pieces. Windows 7 SP1, I believe, is going to have a version 8 client available for it. And then Windows 8 and above will have a Windows client for it. And then you'll see the thin client vendors and everybody else coming out with an evolution to support these things. The remote desktop client version 8. Yeah. Remember, RemoteFX it's not a process, it's kind of like a ethereal term of all these good things that it brings. So one of the interesting things is now they support UDP and TCP side by side. And they'll actually do dynamic choice based upon connection. So RDP has long been a TCP-bound protocol, which is great for connections that may have some instability, but UDP, obviously, when we have excellent high bandwidth, high reliable connections available to us, I don't need TCP to do all this checking for me. So it'd be great if I could slam things over UDP because it's a much more efficient protocol in order to move these things along. So one of the things that are advancing this is you will automatically determine whether it should use UDP or TCP based upon the connection state and what it has available. So it will flip-flop across these two. The next big thing is adaptive graphics. So previously, in order, when you had your, Nelly would kill me if I said the screen scrape term, but basically you had your window up and you have all these things that are going on the screen. You didn't really have, it was pretty much all being fed to you through the same type of graphics feed. Now it's adaptive graphics, so they can mix and match the codecs that are being used to display the on-screen content on the fly. So if I have a window up that's displaying a moving video along with some other portion of the screen that has text and graphics and some other content, it will actually use different codecs to display those pieces of it and chop them up. So it makes it much more efficient to say I can feed all the text information very rapidly down to you. I could progressively build graphics to be able to take some of the immediate load off, but then get the benefits of I see the graphic and it's getting a little sharper, but I'm not sacrificing that line paint that goes along with that. And media is being streamed through a new codec that's going to push that content through. So maybe my media would suffer if conditions weren't perfect, but the rest of my content could be pushed through and displayed very, very well. And then you end up with something like this. So, a Big Buck Bunny is a great display piece for running on Windows Media. Each one of these different areas can be displayed and run through different codecs simultaneously as I'm reading this and feeding this over a VDI or an RDS session. So this was something interesting. Who's run into this? If you're trying to do anything with RemoteFX before, I know you ran into this. What's the default selection here on this client when you're connecting over RDP? Fire up a system. First time you pop it open, what does it connect with? It's like it's a low bandwidth connection. It shuts all the stuff down. It automatically detects this low bandwidth. And RemoteFX is to drive you nuts because that was one of the glitches that you'd find. You try to connect over RemoteFX, you'd have to have this on LAN in order for RemoteFX to get enabled. If it was on any other thing, then it would detect the client is not running full optimized on the other end of it, and it would shut it down. They actually do full detection of the client automatically, the bandwidth capabilities, and they'll turn on and turn off. You still have the ability to do all the individual shutdowns on pieces that you want to stop from pushing through, but it will automatically determine this. And RDP is fully optimized now for 256-point touch interface. So touch is going to get big. I forget who was it. Pixelworks. Who was the company Microsoft just acquired to make giant screen televisions that you can do all kinds of great things with? What was that? Perceptive Pixel? Is that it? So, touch is here to stay. Look at Windows 8. Look at Server 2012. Server 2012 is a full Metro interface. And even things like the Server Manager interface are kind of larger and more even touch friendly. And I know that there's a lot of people screaming about that today, but 2 to 3 years from now, touchscreens are going to be proliferating everywhere. Our laptops will be touchscreens. Those big monitors that we have on the wall in the data centers may be touchscreens or touchscreen overlaid. So things are changing around that. USB redirection. So one of the stumbling blocks that you had in the first version, so RemoteFX version 1 brought all this great USB redirection capabilities, but one of the limitations was it only worked when you had the 3D video adapter enabled in a Windows 7 virtual machine for VDI. So you had to have everything set up so that RemoteFX worked for VDI, and then you got the ability to also do the USB redirection. This was not something that was available on RDS. So that is no longer required. That limitation is no longer there. You can use it with GPU, without GPU. I can use this client driverless scenario to do USB redirection through to an RDS session, and I can have my scanners, my printers, game controllers, my USB-based monitoring Coke machine cooler, any of those things that I have in there, they are all available for me to use.
Are you aware of what similar devices this still work?
For which?
We have a problem with our USB now. That if the two devices are exactly the same, it gets confused.
How so? When you two devices that are identical on two different clients are going into the same RDS. I haven't tested that. I can't say one way or the other. There have been a lot of changes in the redirection. So, yeah. Medical? Is it?
No, it's a credit card reader.
Okay. Yeah, I would definitely try that with the new platform to see.
Sort of isolated.
How do you handle that now? Do you have to do different RDS servers in order to handle it, or?
Exactly. I think you have 6 clients on different servers.
Ouch. That's a case for VDI.
I know, but we're trying to fix it.
Yeah.
At this point, they just fixed it.
What happens? So the hardware identifier is identical for every single one of these.
You can change something in the shippers.
I'm not aware of it. Anybody? Any ideas? I don't know if everybody heard that. So the problem he's having is that the two clients connecting with the exact same device plugged into USB are confusing the RDS server because they have the exact same hardware identifier. Can that be? What was that? Well, yeah. With 2012? Oh, gotcha, because the isolation has been improved for the USB redirection. Yeah, so that might.
Yes, it's really isolated.
So this is interesting. This has been getting a lot of buzz. So you have GPU-less virtual GPU. And the idea was to avoid the need to buy these big, fat, expensive, power-hungry, heat-blowing cards and putting them into the box. So it was great that Microsoft was able to virtualize the GPUs and carve these up into virtual machines and let them use that. But how much was that really helping the situation? VDI were trying to reduce the costs because long ago we were sold that it was going to be cheaper and better and awesome, and that obviously didn't work out. So for us to continue to feed expensive hardware into environments, what does that really bring? 2012 introduces a soft GPU. So it can actually leverage commodity CPU and memory in the device, in the hardware host, and leverage that to create a virtual GPU, and then schedule that virtual GPU workload accordingly. And then interface directly to that 3D accelerated adapter that sits in the virtual machine. So it basically just removes the need to have this physical card, and I can go ahead and use this virtual GPU. Limitation on that is it is for DirectX 11 only. DirectX 11 has been around for quite a while. There's a lot of things that have been written for it. But if you happen to have something that is based on DirectX 10, then you're going to have to be using a hardware card in order to enable that workload. So should you go physical or virtual for this? So what's the difference between them? Right? So we know that Intel and AMD CPUs are completely different animals than GPUs that are engineered specifically for code to handle video processing. There is a distinct difference between these two. So if you're looking to accelerate general video, things like that, give myself full arrow type interfaces, soft GPUs would work for that. If I have really heavy 3D applications that I'm trying to accelerate from RemoteFX, I still really should have the hardware GPUs that are in there. The hardware GPU, I got asked, what's the mapping limitations? It's 12 VMs per physical GPU core is the maximum stretch that you can do for physical GPU cards to VMs, in case anybody was interested. I think it does get reduced based on the number. Well, no, because what happens is the amount of memory allocated from the card is reduced based upon the number of displays that you pick. So when you pick more displays, your maximum resolution capabilities are reduced as a result of that. So when I have one or two displays, I can have a massive pixel footprint for that. But if I stretch it 2, 3, 4 monitors, then the maximum size of that display gets reduced. It just accommodates for the memory. I'm sorry, say that again? It's the number, that's a mapping to the number of cores in the CPU, in the GPU, 12 to 1.
Does the client need to have special video stuff?
No. The client just needs to be running an appropriate version of the RDC client, which is 7.1, to be able to talk RemoteFX. And they don't require any specific hardware other than that.
So how come these thin clients are more expensive when it comes to RemoteFX than out there? If they're running their $100 one for VMview, but the minute you say RemoteFX, they go to $300.
We haven't seen that, but the big issue we've seen is that they have to be Windows-based thin clients. So that cheap, Linux-based distribution thin client that's only $100 is great. That'll work for basic RDP and those kinds of things. But in order for you to be able to use RemoteFX, you have to have Windows 7 SP1 based thin client, which means you pay a license to Microsoft.
Wait a year.
Wait a year.
Well, pre-RDP, I assume will eventually support remote.
Yeah, and there's a, we haven't tested it, but there is a Linux-based RemoteFX client out there. Yeah, I haven't tested it yet, but everything looks like it would work. So if you had a Linux-based thin client, you put that on there, should give you RemoteFX. So now we're starting to stretch out of the specific things that are RemoteFX and kind of into Server 2012, RDS capabilities, VDI. Server 2012 introduces support for the RDS web with multiple browsers. So now Chrome, Firefox, Safari, those are all supported, as well as obviously the plethora of IE types that are there. There's a new version of the RDP Client that comes along with this, version 8. It's embedded in Windows 8. It's embedded in Server 2012. There will be something coming out for Windows 7 SP1 at some point in the future. And there's the lipstick on the pig is not a derogatory comment. It's just a term I tend to use when they pretty something up that's pretty much the same thing running underneath. Anybody play with this on the Windows 8 side? So there's a full Metro client for RDP built into Windows 8. It's actually pretty slick. I think it comes with it. It's out in the store as well. I have it on the machine already. But it gives you a nice interface. Who here uses the one that Microsoft produced? That's out on TechNet that you download. You have your pane of Windows RDP machines over on the side. Kind of close to that. When you're in one of these systems here and you're on full screen, you go up to the top, there's a little tag that pulls down, and you'll have a thumbnail of all machines you're connected to across the top. So it's a really nice interface when you're working in multiple systems over RDP. You can pop in and out of them. It doesn't have the authentication pass-through and policy that way, but it's still nice. So the setup experience has been really improved, and I'm not going to dive too much into this because Mike Nelson has a session on Thursday, and I promised I wouldn't steal any of his thunder for it. But there is it's all wizard driven now to set this up. Used to be a lot of different interfaces that you'd have to go in and out of in order to get RDS or VDI set up in Windows Server 2008. Much more streamlined now. It actually kind of asks you a bunch of questions as you're walking through the interface. Is this for RDS? Is this for VDI? Are you going to be doing pooled VDI or personal VDI? And it'll kind of walk you through and set things up, and then they've unified a lot of the interfaces together. So there's a lot of changes along that line. And then who's played with Server Manager interface in 2012? Right? Nice, right? Huge improvement. So now you can have a farm of RDS servers that are out there and actually manage them as a collection right from this interface. So there's a lot of improvements that are there. Not something that's specific to RDC, but something that's definitely worth mentioning. So VDI has changed. And you're going to learn a lot of this if you go to the underpinnings of this and the setup process if you go to Mike's session. But this has been changed quite a bit in 2012. They actually have a pooled collection. I swear that somebody from Citrix came over with a whole bunch of intel and information about how to make this happen in RDS on its own. Either that or they set up some kind of little funny cross agreement, because it works very, very similar to the way that you spin up Zen desktop pools using their cloning technology. But basically it gives you the ability to do managed or unmanaged. Unmanaged meaning managed is I'm going to start with a single source machine and it will create the clones off of this system and maintain them. I only ever have to go back and patch my source VHD. I only have to care and feed for one image. Unmanaged is I have a whole bunch of machines that somebody created out there. I want to create a pool out of them. I can just grab them and collect them and put them together and set that up. So what it does is it sets up with a single source VHD. So you build your Windows machine that you're going to set up. You put all your utilities, your apps, all these things that are on it. And then you get it all set, you sysprep it, you drop it down, and then that becomes your template. Incidentally, none of this requires Virtual Machine Manager 2012. So in the past, if I talked about templates, everybody's mind immediately went over to, oh, I need System Center for this. All this is not tied, none of this is tied to System Center in any way. So you create that system, then you start to drive through the wizard around creating this pool, and it'll ask you things like, give me all of the answer information around completing this sysprep process, because what it's going to do is it's going to say, you want a pool of 100 systems. Perfect. Here's my source VHD. What storage do I want to put them on? Do I want to put them out on a CSV? Do I want to put them on local storage? Do I want to put them on UNC path using SMB v3? Answer all my sysprep pieces, and then it will go and start cranking these systems out. And if anybody worked with VMM 2012 deploying templates? Same thing. So all it does is it spits out the machine, turns it on. That floppy, virtual floppy disk that you see in every virtual machine that nobody can figure out what it's used for, it's used for the sysprep process. An answer text file is dropped onto a virtual floppy file. It's mounted to the VM, answers all the questions around sysprep, comes up, and it invents a virtual machine off of that. And then the changes that are made to that virtual machine are flushed when the user logs off. It's basically using snapshots to roll everything back. VMM's not needed. You can also do personal desktop collections. I talked about that a little bit before. That's just one-to-one mapping. I'm going to create a collection. I'm going to allocate every virtual machine to a person. So you're going to have a machine assigned to you that is now your system. You're tattooed to it. Whatever you do to that system is permanently yours. A little side note. So when we were going through the process of playing around with this, we realized that by default, this is a very serial operation. So I said, let's create a 100 VM pool for virtual machines on VDI, right? Sounds great. How long does it take to run the sysprep process on a system, generally speaking? How long? 15? That's longer than I would have gone, but I've seen it. About 4 to 5 minutes is the general time, depending upon how much memory is there, all those kinds of things. One at a time is by default. Just creates one VM at a time. So 100 times 5 minutes is 500 minutes.
Here's a question, I kind of talked about this earlier, is that when I'm deploying templates in library, that disk count is brutal. Like no matter what type of configuration I use.
Yep.
At one at a time, well, it's even slower because protocol can even make it 1,000 on the library.
Well, it's slow because it's bits, right? If it was a straight file copy, it would be a lot faster, right? Here, remember, I'm not copying. So when I create a pooled desktop, it's one disk that becomes read-only for me, and I create a diff. I leverage a differencing disk against it for this scenario.
It's smaller, but it's still a copy, or it's coming from the library?
No, it just gets generated. It gets generated, and so it goes, okay, create new VM number 12. I'm going to turn it on. It's going to create its delta, and then all the write activity happens in a delta file. That's interesting, though. So the delta files, remember, are all AVHDs. That's the differencing disk. Those are dynamically expanding. So if you end up with virtual machines that are going to be subject to a lot of I/O, that could be a constraint, because we all know that dynamically expanding disks are not as efficient as fixed disks. Although generally for OSs, it doesn't matter too much. So anyway, while I got sidetracked there, if you want to speed this up, there's a registry key that you can go in. You can actually speed it up to a grand total of a blazing 5 at a time. So it'll help, but it certainly won't be mind-boggling. So I can reduce my time by 1/20th or 1/5. So there's also this concept of user profile disks. So this is something that's been stirring around on the VMware side for a while, about splitting off what the user side of the information is. You know, in the RDS world, we've been battling with profiles since the beginning of time, right? RES, AppSense, these different profile companies that are out there that have reinvented user workspace virtualization have changed a lot of things in terms of trying to deploy large-scale, non-persistent desktop environments. But they're really just solving the same problem that we've been up against for 15 years, right? Citrix Metaframe 1.0, we still had roaming profile issues to deal with. This looks to take that away and actually store user-side settings in a completely different VHD that can be dynamically attached to a virtual machine based upon what they're logging into. So I have a pool of systems, 100 virtual machines that are out there. I log in. My profile and personal settings are actually in a separate virtual hard disk file that gets attached to the virtual machine when I'm dropping into that system. And then those settings are overlaid on top of it. So this can kind of solve the profile issues for VDI. Sort of, right? I see you shrugging. I know exactly where your mind is rolling too, right? I mean, it's nice. The thing I will equate this to is that, remember, every time Microsoft advances the technology, they never go all the way. And I'm convinced it's not because they don't want to go all the way. It's that they have a lot of ecosystem partners out there that are plugging these holes, and they can't squash an industry around something that they decide to come up with, unless they just go out and say, you know what, let's buy it, it's perfect for us to own and be our own. So I call this poor man's virtualization or user state virtualization for Microsoft VDI, because it will do just that. It will allow you to do everything pushed over, or I can even say, you know, I want just the desktop, the documents, and the app data, but forget the rest. Don't care about it. So you can specify what type of things should go into the VHD. If it's not in that VHD, and I'm using a pooled desktop environment, and I log off that system, what happens? Goes away, right? So the whole point is to make it as streamlined as possible. Remember, when you're using pooled, I log off, everything goes away. These can also be stored in a UNC path as well. They do not need to be on a physical system. So here's some quick bullet points of things that are interesting around Server 2012 that aren't necessarily RDS or VDI related, but they certainly are nice to see that Server 2012 is advancing virtualization. Support for up to 160 logical processors per host, 2 terabytes of memory per host, 64 virtual CPUs per VM, 2 terabytes of memory per VM. Any of these change in the last 3 weeks? Right. When they went to RC from beta, they doubled some of these numbers up. There's a new VHDX format that goes up to 64 terabytes per virtual machine, per virtual hard disk. That was that the change they made in when they went to RC? Did they double those? Is it 4 terabytes per? I think it's 4. Is it 4? I'll find out. It might be 4 terabytes per host now. Today in SP1, it's 1 terabyte addressable by the hypervisor. Some other interesting things. One of the things that they did, share nothing live migration. You know, basically what that is it's the equivalent of a VMware storage migration followed by a live migration. It's nice to have, but the big impact that this has is that they've broken the chain between having a cluster of HyperV servers and getting the benefits of live migration. Previously in Server 2008 R2, if I wanted to have live migration capabilities, I needed a cluster of virtual machines, and that cluster was my migration boundary. Can't move machines in and out of that live. They can move around in the pool live, in that cluster live. Now in 2012, that chain is broken. So I can have live migration, standalone hosts, or in and out of different clusters. Caveat for that would be I'm either using some kind of storage that would be available to all of them, like CSV would only be available intercluster. So I'd be doing a migration across storage. Or I'm using SMB version 3 to be able to put the virtual machines onto a UNC point. Right? Who's using NetApp on the VMware side? Right? Big benefits to that. Get rid of a lot of the block storage issue or pain points that are there. Same thing. So in Server 2012, you can now use an SMB point for that. But it has to be version V3.
There is no need for clustering then. You can have different.
Clustering gives you high availability.
Still needs high, still
But,
automatically won't move.
what was that?
So it will not automatically move if the host goes down.
Correct. without high availability. High availability is part of the cluster. Live migration is no longer a requirement of clustering. Reverse that around. Clustering is no longer a requirement for it. Storage live migration, it's kind of nice to be able to move things around. You'll notice on here, I don't have anything specifically mentioned around HA because generally with VDI, or even with RDS to an extent, we don't care about high availability because we're building commodity systems that if it goes down, whatever, you're going to log in, you're going to get a new system, you'll pick up wherever you left off on that. Concurrent live migrations, if you have to do any systems on to do evacuation for maintenance, et cetera, and you could do some prioritization of live migrations and actually limit the number of concurrent per individual host. So if you have some hosts that are kind of tilted, this one's got lots of bandwidth, this one is only using gig cards, you could set some limitations on that so that the small system doesn't go over 4 concurrent migrations at a time. Dynamic memory. So there's a new parameter that's in there for minimum memory. Who here has played around with dynamic memory in HyperV? Right? It is the enabler for VDI because memory is the #1 constraint in the virtualization world, and with VDI, it's even more so. We're struggling to squeeze every dollar out of infrastructure that we can, and memory is the cap for our infrastructure.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Who here in 2008 HyperV has played with dynamic memory and had it regularly work?
Me. Yeah. What have you had issues with?
Not allocating, so say set it to 1, grow to 2 for high speed or Win7 session, and it just never grows. Utilization goes up to 100%, but you never see it grow.
You never see it grow? If that's the case, then 2 things. It's either that the virtual machine, if the virtual machine is in fact configured for dynamic memory, then the integration services in that system have not been upgraded to the SP1 level. So Windows 7 will run, Windows 7 non-SP1 can do dynamic memory as long as the HyperV Server 2008 R2 SP1 integration services are present in the VM. So you have to upgrade the service, the integration tools in order to enable that. The only other thing that could be is you could be turning off the dynamic memory tool checkbox, but that's something you have to do manually. Smart paging is something that's new. Smart paging is a piece of the dynamic memory part of HyperV. It's really meant to handle mass power on events. So if you're familiar with dynamic memory is meant to deal with the fluctuations of system memory requirements. So systems power on, they might have steeper memory requirements and they kind of settle back into an idle process. You have systems that kind of turn on low and then services start to ride up and utilize. They need to grab more memory. Dynamic memory is meant to kind of deal with those things. This new parameter minimum allows you to start a virtual machine with a higher number and then push itself back down to a smaller number later. So the startup memory that's a hard number. If I set, I'm going to use an example, say I set 2 gigs as my startup, 4 gigs as my maximum, 1 gig as my minimum. The machine turns on, the BIOS reads 2 gigs of RAM out of that system, on that virtual machine. It boots up, Windows says, ooh, that's cool, that's awesome, I got 2 gigs of RAM, no problem. The running processes that are running in there don't require 2 gigs of RAM, they only require 680 megabytes of memory. So what will happen is HyperV on the back end will pull back the amount of physical memory blocks allocated to that VM down to a minimum of your minimum parameter, which is 1 gig in our little sample here. As the demand increases in there, I'm going to allow that to rise up to my maximum, so I could surpass the minimum. But the minimum and the difference between the minimum and the startup can actually benefit you when you have a big power on event, like an HA scenario. I have a machine that blows up. I have 22 virtual machines that I need to power on suddenly, and I'm going to put a severe memory demand on the cluster for that purpose. If things are tight, then what can happen is what Server 2012 will allow you to do is if I have startup RAM of 2 gigs, minimum RAM of 1 gig, the difference between 1 gig and 2 gigs I can make up for in temporary page file swap just to be able to present the virtual machine with 2 gigabytes of RAM. But it's a temporary holding place in order to get the virtual machine turned on and booted. Once that system is up and dynamic memory wakes up through the tool set coming online, then it's going to dissolve that page file and go back to physical memory. And then things will start to get tight. It could increase it if that is required for it. Yeah. Because you have to remember, too, just because the startup RAM has to be given 2 gigs of RAM, it may not have to write anything more than 600 megs into RAM. And if it can write it into physical memory, it will. It won't use the swap file. Right? It's a good question, though. It could impact it. Here's the thing I always say. If you get into a situation where you're going to start needing smart paging, then chances are you're overcommitted already, and you should have more resources available. This is really something that you would use on the server side. Smart paging is going to be most effective in mass power on events, which are HA failures, which means I have a cluster, which means I'm probably not running VDI, because I don't need a cluster to run a VDI environment. I don't need to have redundancy to that level. HyperV replica could be useful in RDS scenarios. Anybody read up on HyperV replica? It's SRM for the poor man. It basically allows you to do VM by VM replication from one server to another. Could be in the same location, different locations, with no SAN involvement whatsoever. So I don't need to get the SAN team involved in setting up any kind of replication scheme between those points. I can have this machine replicated to that host, and in that replication process, I can actually inject additional new IP parameters for the move, so that if I have this system being replicated to this data center, I can have the machine turn on and inject different IP address info so that the system comes up with connected. It's the replication is occurring by replicating the disk, but then the skeleton VM on the other side is a brand new generation of a new VMX, or XML. Uses snapshot technology. Just like doing, it's just like doing a disk transfer.
It must all shadow and then transfer the shadow, just like a backup?
Sorry. It's using VSS. It's using the VSS writer. It uses the VSS writer to do the transfer of the disk. What was that?
It's quite behind and quite intensive, right?
Depends on how much I/O is changing in the VM. If you're talking about boot volumes, not much. Once it gets the
VSS do the whole thing once?
No, VSS can do block delta changes. VSS is completely Hyper-V aware to be able to do VHD replication or VHD block level change grabs.
So if you have almost sync VHD, how long would it take? I mean, every time you change something, it does VSS and then sends it?
Just the delta change gets pushed to the other side.
So there's 3 things. So it does VSS and then changes.
Well, no, the VSS writer captures the change and sends the change down to the other side.
Every time you write something.
Every time you write something.
Just like storage vMotion.
Yeah. Well, no, because storage vMotion uses a snapshot.
Different technology,
Same concept, though.
snapshot, your journal, a lot of changes.
Right, and just send the change. I'm just snipping the changes down the wire. Fault tolerance, sort of, but fault tolerance is only memory footprint changes. And I think that's the biggest waste of time the VMware ever made anyway, fault tolerance. Support for UNC-based storage in V3. This is all over anything Server 2012 related. Microsoft is pushing everybody off of block storage as fast as possible, or expensive block storage, and saying, go to UNC path. Because the SMB V3, marketing speak, I haven't seen a single test that backs this up, but I have no reason to not believe it, is less than 2% delta difference off of block storage performance to go to a file-based store. Native NIC teaming is nice. You get the third-party vendors out of the way. So there's lots of interesting things that are in here. things that are related to VDI, things that are related to RDS, remoting protocol. What matters out of this? What do you think out of all these brand new things that 2012 brings? What out of this stack of new stuff in the box, what matters? Management console, big change. Yep. What about RemoteFX? It's kind of where I wanted to lead this particular conversation. Was, you know, the title of the session was what's new in RemoteFX with 2012, also tying it to VDI and RDS. But what about RemoteFX attracts you to it? It's definitely improved. The improvements in RemoteFX are in the improvements in RDP. RDP is no longer a LAN-specific protocol. It can work very well on the WAN. It's not up to the same levels of an HDX in high latency environments, but it's certainly going to catch up a lot of the middle ground, where there was such a gap before between what you could get done with RDP and then what you had to look elsewhere for. Big changes there, right? What else? Come on. The physical GPU to do virtual GPU, right? That's nice, but how many workloads? And this is where I like to keep the line between. We're all techno geeks. We absolutely love technology. We're in this room because we love technology. We're in the jobs that we are because we love technology. How much of this stuff is actually addressing a business issue that clients are having?
Pretty small markets.
It is.
That in the healthcare business.
Healthcare is probably the biggest, right? And it's getting bigger all the time, right? Particularly when you look at the integrations they've done for multi-touch capability, improved remote WAN support over the protocol. All those things are going to play very well into healthcare industry because they're going to touch. They're going to touch screen or connect. We've even seen. I'm from the Northeast, so there's hospitals all up and down the coast that just gobble up tons of money. But they're doing a lot with. We've seen some interesting things where they're using Connect type gesturing to be able to manipulate X-rays on the screen, because when they have their hands in a patient, they can't go over and touch anything, so they can actually alter what's going on in the interface with that. So having that capability integrated here, that's a big benefit.
Be careful of blood splatter.
Hopefully we don't have to deal with splatter in the operating room. Splatter means a mistake was made, right? But these are still point solutions. This is not something that's attacking the masses. The RDC changes are going to certainly benefit everybody in terms of looking at using RDP as a protocol across the board. But what about the rest? So it's great now that I could use RDP for all of this. But how far then does the VDI solution take the requirements for that? That leads to my next question.
Are we still connected? It's been said that you need a HyperV to run a RemoteFX. Is that still true?
Yes. Yes. HyperV is RemoteFX specific. RemoteFX is HyperV specific.
Okay. This gentleman here, the session before you, he was running on a Mac 2012 server, and he was showing us how RemoteFX works. In parallel. Without any HyperV.
He was doing RDS session though, correct? Not VDI?
No, RDS session.
He was doing an RDS session. So he's taking advantage of the codec, but he's not doing any virtual GPU acceleration or anything like that. So let me separate the two. The RDP protocol changes in Server 2012, the acceleration codecs, they work outside of the hypervisor under the covers. So if you're running 2012 RDS servers on VMware or Parallels or whatever, that'll work because it's client connectivity into server connectivity, and it's between me and you. I'm the client, you're the server, you're running 2012, we're all talking RDC 8. I can have the acceleration capabilities. I can have RDP over UDP. I can have, all those multi-codec.
So if I have a Windows 8 and use turn on the remote, that was remote desktop on professional version, then that will be the same, right?
That would be the same. If I want to do 3D acceleration, soft GPU integration, those are HyperV specific capabilities.
So you turn that on, so this software GP is turned on in HyperV.
Correct, because it's actually, what it requires is a virtual 3D video adapter in the VM, which is only available on a HyperV virtual machine. That's to do the hardware-based soft acceleration for that. If I'm just looking to get the benefits of RDP version 8, then I don't need HyperV under the covers to do that. Yeah.
What about all these new features, they're not available on like the Mac client, right?
Today, no. But that's not to say that somebody's not going to write that.
And do these, like, do they work across the RDP gateway?
In 2012, yes.
Microsoft, no plans to come up with a new Mac client which supports RDP gateway?
I can't answer for Microsoft on that. I would doubt that they're going to write a Mac client.
So my understanding is RemoteFX Client technology is broadly licensed, and indeed is eminently suitable for purely hardware-based implementation. Microsoft has a program to allow people to do that, and they have no problem with, sure, there's an authorized team on Mac, but you can license it to do that.
Yep, and write your own.
They probably won't produce a Mac RDP client or a RDP, whether it's on their RDP client, RemoteFX client, but the technology is licensable, so somebody's going to do it.
Yeah.
They'll do it for every widget that you ever made, including the code.
Yeah, they absolutely will.
There is a RemoteFX implementation of pre-RDP, open source RDP.
Right, for Linux. Now, it's not updated to this yet, but it's updated so that it works with 2008 R2 SP1. Yes.
The USB option, is that a related thingy or?
Not anymore.
So I can just upgrade my VMs without touching my host?
Your
I would receive that benefit, right?
VMs are running what?
VMs are running 2008 R2. My host is running 2008 R2. I'll leave my host alone. I upgrade my VM to 2012, and hopefully my USB probably so.
Yes, because they're no longer, the USB no longer requires the virtual machine to have the RemoteFX adapter in the VM.
But assuming your client is RDC 8.
Correct. And the server has to be running RDC 8 on the server side as well.
And that can only be Windows 7 or above, right?
Today it's Windows 8 or Server 2012. There's no client out there for RDP 8, RDC 8 on Windows 7 yet. There will be one. Yeah, but I think the requirement is going to be Service Pack 1 is going to be a requirement for that. So
Is RDC, just like RDP protocol specs are available, Microsoft has open source, right? So is the RDP 8,
it's not open sourced. It's licensable.
not like, I mean, the specs are available, you can write your own client without being
Correct. Yes, but the free RDP, I think they had to do something with Microsoft in order to get licensability for RemoteFX. And probably even for the RDP client itself. I don't know the terms of the licensing for that development end of things. I'm sure they had to pay something in order to do that.
I don't know about the RemoteFX, but the Microsoft publishes RDP protocol specs.
Yes, they do. Doesn't mean it's free. Might be free. I don't know. I'm sure that there's somebody that you have to, I'm sure there's something that has to be paid. So for requirements for RemoteFX, in order to make it work, full blown now, I'm talking, the whole stack up to virtual GPU and everything. DirectX 910, 11 capable GPU cards for hardware-based, and that's today. And you can also do that in 2012. So remember, just because they have the soft GPU capabilities now doesn't mean they abandoned hardware GPUs. Hardware GPUs are still alive and well, and they still have their place to be used. CAD, heavyweight 3D applications, medical type applications. Those things are going to be here to stay. If it's Server 2012, they can leverage the soft GPU in DirectX 11. Windows 8 64-bit driver has to be updated, and obviously there's a requirement for a Slack-capable CPU. That's been there all along.
Has the GPU HCL expanded in 2012?
Haven't heard that it has. Yeah, I haven't heard that it has. It is. It is. Finding a card that supports it. Now, there's a bunch of unsupported cards that are out there. I know that there are consumer-grade cards that you can get working with it, but they obviously won't. They're not going to run a server workload. They're, it's nice for testing, and it's unsupported, but who cares? It's a test.
Mike.
Okay, thank you. We kind of covered this, so I'll jump over this in terms of dynamic memory. But I have this slide in here because it's right on the front end of the requirement slide. And if you're doing anything with remote desktop or RDS VDI, dynamic memory is a requirement on the HyperV side. I have a lot of discussions around dynamic memory. I've been involved with VMware forever. Been involved with HyperV since its inception back in 2008. I think that dynamic memory is an interesting approach to the memory issues that are out there. Memory is the number one bottleneck. It's the number one place that you lose your capacity. More cores are always coming out. It's always available. It's always about how much memory you can jam in the box and still stay in a reasonable price point. Two different methodologies for dealing with memory. VMware kind of looks at it and says, I'll just throw everything at it and I'll deal with it on the back end. The opposite perspective of that is dynamic memory, which is I'm going to give you a smaller amount of memory and I will let you ask for more and increase your memory on demand as the workload actually requires it. There are some things that this does not work with. If we're talking about server workloads, don't do this with SQL. Right? SQL is a monster and will continue to grab as much memory as it can. And if I set my maximum RAM up to 64 gigs, come back 3 weeks later, that virtual machine is using 64 gigabytes of RAM if I haven't tuned the SQL processes to dumb themselves down. So there's places where this gets tripped up, but if you know where it's applicable and where it's not, it certainly can be a big help. And having a lower minimum requirement certainly also helps. So licensing requirements for RemoteFX. This does not talk about what we had just discussed, which was development requirements. I don't know what that is, but in terms of me being captain customer and I want to license this, RemoteFX requires software assurance, and it requires a VDA license, because I must have remote capabilities in my licensing in order to do this. For VDI, VDA license cost is about $100 or so per year for the subscription. Software assurance obviously has its own prices. Anybody point this out? Who's a consultant in here? Who does consulting with clients? Anybody bring this up to clients? I'm floored how many clients are way out of compliance on this. They refuse to do software assurance. They don't really want to buy the VDA license, but they want to virtualize the desktops. And you technically can't do that in a Windows world. The EULA is violated at the moment you decide that you're going to put that virtual machine on a different piece of hardware, either via vMotion or HA. So know that that's there. It's better that they find out before by you than somewhere later. Does RemoteFX work with Zen Desktop? It actually does. There's an article that will give you all the gory details about how to set this up. Basically, it's registry keys that you turn on or make some configuration changes so that you can leverage this in a Zen Desktop environment. No. This would be pushing RDP over through a Zen Desktop environment. So you're using Zen Desktop actually just is your brokering capabilities to connect in. Yeah, you're using their technology to fill the gap on the brokering capabilities for Windows Server. Some interesting performance counters around RemoteFX, and these are the things that are going to give you some indication about what's going on. In terms of graphics, so there's a counter in there called RemoteFX Graphics. In this, you'll find a few ones. Frame quality, which will have a percentage counter number. That's the percentage of the rendered quality versus the source. So if it's telling you it's 50%, that means I'm only really getting half the quality or half the rendering of the original. Source and output frames per second, these are two different counters, source frames per second, output frames per second. You can use these to determine what kind of performance am I getting on the source versus what's actually making it down to the client in frames per second. The compression ratio based upon the source and the destination. It will show you what those pieces are. And then frames skipped per second. If you're having any issues, this actually will identify, is the frame skipped being done by the client? Is it something in the network, or is it on the server side? Is the server saying, I'm skipping it because I won't be able to get it to you in time, I'm going to do every other or every third? Is it on the client that's just not able to process? Is it a network problem in between? These things will all help try to troubleshoot what's going on and why is this experience not what I expect it to be. RemoteFX network, current TCP and current UDP bandwidth. Again, these are two different counters. Same thing with the second one. Both these counters will help identify, am I using TCP, am I using UDP, what percentage of time am I using TCP versus UDP. It'll allow you to realize if I'm getting any benefits out of it. These counters are obviously 2012 very specific, and retransmission rate. For GPU management, there's actually two sets. There's the root GPU management. So for VMs that are running RemoteFX, if you want to know, am I really using RemoteFX acceleration? This is the counter. This will tell you how many virtual machines are really using RemoteFX and which ones, for some reason, aren't, because the hardware GPU isn't right or the client isn't configured for a LAN-based protocol or whatever it is. And then how much, two RAM parameters, the reserve and the megabyte per GPU for the virtual machine. And then VM virtual GPU management will show you timeout detection and recovery, things that are happening on both the virtual machine and things that are happening on the servers that are pushed into the virtual machines. So these are all things that will help you either identify or troubleshoot RemoteFX experiences and why they're not so more. So if you want more, Mike Nelson, handsome guy that he is going to be doing a great session on, oh wait a minute, I think this is on Thursday. So ignore the Wednesday in green. He's in Breakout 2 on Thursday the 26th at 2:40. Session time is this same one. He's going to be running through the actual setup process for going through and creating pooled desktops and putting the bolts together for that. Cool. Any questions, thoughts, experiences, enlightenment? Is that the new one? Nice. How you like it?
Yeah, I love it so far. Very nice.
I have the old one, which I like, but I have the old dongle, so I couldn't use it here.
Scalability for Microsoft VDI at this point, irrespective of RemoteFX.
Irrespective of RemoteFX. I mean, unless you were going to go heavy-duty GPU and you had to figure out what your capabilities were going to be to slice up the GPUs. Who in here has the largest VDI deployment? Who thinks they have the largest VDI deployment that they've either done or seen or heard of? Come on. 10,000 desktops. Anybody?
30.
How many?
30.
30,000 desktops. Persistent or non?
Persistent.
Non-persistent. 10,000. 5,000. 2,000? Interesting. Take a look around. Nobody's raising their hand, right? Persistent desktop, not so hard, because I'm tattooing a person. It's a personal desktop. It's my machine. I'm going to run it. I had a slide up there. We're going to kick open a discussion. Just for time, I kind of glanced over it a little bit. VDI is not the promise that it was started out to be. One, it was originally presented that it was going to save everybody money. Gone. Not even possible. Two, it was going to be the answer to migrating to Windows 7, or it was going to be the answer to getting around the troubles of the desktop today. Not possible, because while I can create persistent desktops of large pools, I'm definitely not saving any money then. I'm spending way more money than I am on the traditional desktop. And the number one issue that we've always run into with non-persistent desktop is that there's no problem with the technology. I can absolutely build the technology to do a 30,000 deployment of non-persistent. But the problem is I could build a giant container to hold 30,000 VMs that I can't get any business users on, because unless their applications are organized and ready to go, and I can manage their persona in a seamless way and track all the things they need and deal with the data and all the operational considerations around VDI, that's where the thing falls apart. So I can build a big container and put lots of VMs in it, but nobody's going to be able to use it because operationally I'm not ready. And we run into this all the time. We're trying to help clients move to Windows 7. We always go back, we start with the applications, and it's a mess. They're in the closet over there. You open the closet, it's, you get dumped on. So that's kind of been always the big hindrance for that. Some of these pieces in RemoteFX, RDP, they're all improving what's out there to be able to be done, but promise isn't there for the big scale. So scalability, hey, technology-wise, it could definitely happen. I don't think that link clone technology is the big winner for mass VDI deployment. PVS is certainly far more scalable in terms of that. So again, when you look at this, it's going to fail. It's going to fail. Anything else? Questions? All right, great. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.